The theme for our event today is beneficial ownership regulations in Canada. As many of you know, the latest move to improve money laundering regulations in Canada came this past June, as new rules under the Canada Business Corporations Act, or the CBCA, now require private federal corporations to create and maintain a new and separate register showing individuals with significant control, with provinces to follow suit. These rules are just one step in Canada's increasing transparency around beneficial ownership. And during the next hour or so, we plan to discuss the context in this country around BO and what organizations like Transparency International Canada are doing to promote greater transparency, including advocating for a publicly accessible registry of beneficial owners. Joining us today is one of the country's preeminent thought leaders in anti-corruption. I see him smiling at that, but it's true. And certainly one of the most vocal and passionate advocates on beneficial ownership, on transparency with us, James Cohen. Just a round of applause for James. Now for your official bio here, James. I hope you don't mind. But Mr. Cohen is the Executive Director of Transparency International Canada. He is an anti-corruption expert with a background in international development and security. James's previous work includes program design and management, training and research for organizations including the U.S. Institute of Peace, the African Center for Justice and Peace Studies, the Global Organization for Parliamentarians Against Corruption, and the Geneva Center for Democratic Control of Armed Forces. James also worked for TI's Defense and Security Program from 2011 to 2013, where he focused on corruption risk to military, police, and peacekeeping, as well as advising governments and civil society. James joined TI Canada in 2016 as Interim Executive Director. He held the post of Director of Programs and Engagement before becoming Executive Director, where he now oversees the organization's management, programming, and external relations. James holds a master's from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva and a Bachelor of Social Science in Poli-Sci from the University of Ottawa. Did you really do all those things? So before we get, we're delighted to have James give us a few remarks today. Before we get into that, just a few housekeeping items. Hopefully you've all found the lunch at the back of the room, as well as the snacks. Restrooms are just down the hall here, as well as a closet for your raincoats. And just in terms of timing, we're going to try to wrap up and have you all out of here at 2:30 at the latest. In terms of the agenda, again, we're going to start by hearing from James Cohen. He's going to give us a few slides on the state of beneficial ownership regulations in Canada, and then James and I will have a discussion on issues ranging from shell companies, registries, privacy, policy recommendations, and then I'll be sure to leave a few minutes for Q&A at the end. So without further ado, James Cohen.
One more housekeeping tip, cell phones, if you can please put them on silent, if you don't mind. That's it, over to you.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone. Just to echo Eric, thanks for coming out on a rainy day. I woke up this morning and I heard the rain and the lightning and thought, well, there goes a couple. I'm busy at lunchtime, but we got a good amount of people who managed to brave the rain. So thank you, everyone. I'd also really like to thank Caseware for putting this on. Full disclosure, Eric was a consultant for us for a couple months this year, moving from the private sector, moved to us, went back to the private sector, so he got to experience the weird and wild world that is working for a nonprofit. I think it was a very different experience for you, talking to general public and to the government. So we're happy that you didn't scream in terror about us, but instead you talked to Anu, who I've known on Twitter for a while, and I'm so delighted that we finally get to meet and decide to hold this event. So thank you again to K-Swear. And also, I see a couple of familiar faces, some new faces. Some of you have been working with us on beneficial ownership in the past, and I hope by the end of this presentation, a lot more of you are going to be joining us on the quest for a public registry of beneficial ownership. So before I get right into things, to go over it, I'll talk a little bit about TI Canada, the status of beneficial ownership transparency in Canada, what TI Canada is doing on the issue, and then we'll move into Eric and I's Q&A. Just a little bit about myself and TI Canada. As Eric described my bio, I'm not an accountant, I'm not a lawyer. A lot of people think I am to be in this job. I was living about a decade overseas doing international development work, and I had to get up to speed with everything going on in Canada very quickly in the last 3 years. TI Canada, thankfully we work with a number of technical experts, a few of whom are in the room, who are much smarter on this topic than me, but do a very good job, I hope, of taking in the knowledge that they pass on and helping guide the organization to the goals that we're trying to achieve. If you want to talk to me also about anything international development related to this issue, more than happy to talk about that. First of all, Transparency International. Show of hands, who before the announcement went out knew Transparency International? I always need to check the room. All right, so a healthy group. So this map is really nothing too new to a lot of you. But for those who don't know, this is the Corruption Perception Index map. It comes out once a year and makes some headlines in terms of did Canada slip one position or go up one position. It ranks about 150 to 180 depending on the year countries in the world, from least corrupt to most corrupt. As we have limited time, I won't do the usual Q&A about this map, but what I do want to say about TI overall is that we're operational in about 100 countries around the world. With our global secretariat in Berlin, TI has been around since 1996, and TI Canada, we've been around since about 1998. And what this map really conveys is that no country is free from corruption. And I do see sometimes people cite the Corruption Perception Index and say, well, how bad can Canada be? We rank 8th. Well, as the next group of people always say to me, how can you rank Canada 8th? We're such a corrupt country. Of which I don't really give credence to either response. We have a good rule of law in this country. We have sound institutions, but we definitely still have our problems in this country. TI Canada, every chapter of TI around the world, we run our own programs and we're independent. Most of us are independently financed. Some organizations do get their finances from Berlin, who gets it from donor governments. The Canadian government is one of the biggest donors of the TI Secretariat. We don't receive money from the Canadian government for the moment. More than happy to talk to anyone in the room about how to help finance us at the end of this. I hope I inspire you all to donate by the end. But our vision is a world in which government, politics, business, civil society, and the daily lives of people are free from corruption. A very bold ambition, but we need to at least strive for the bold if we want to even get anywhere to the medium. How do we do this? Well, we work in 3 ways. One is research, and I'll go through a couple of our reports, and maybe some of you have even seen our reports. We always strive for evidence-based research so that we can then educate and mobilize Canadians. It's not up to us just to fight corruption. We don't want anyone to ever think, why isn't TI Canada doing it, therefore no one's doing it. We want to empower Canadians to find solutions to address the various issues of corruption in the country. But then whenever we do find room to influence change, we do seek that out. And one of our key advocacy areas is on anti-money laundering and the push for a publicly accessible registry of beneficial ownership in Canada. In terms of what we do in priorities, I'll just quickly go through our priorities that we have in our strategic plan 2018-2020. You can download this on our website. It lays out what we're trying to do. One of our top areas is white-collar crime. We've built up an expertise over the last few years on this issue, not just on AML, but also on the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act, deferred prosecution agreements. We came out in favor of that as an extra tool for law enforcement to be using. We want to strengthen and enhance anti-corruption legislation. We've talked to the various provincial governments and the federal government on a number of issues, expand our own government relations, inform Canadians on the many ways that they can address corruption, and the corruption that goes on, and work to advance the global movement. We put out a number of reports that are non-AML related. So for example, we do have a rather large mining project, Mining for Sustainable Development, where we look at transparency in permitting and licensing processes, in mining permits in Ontario, BC, and Yukon. So if that's something that you work on or you have colleagues working on that, happy to talk to you. Another arrow in the quiver was our report that came out in favor of deferred prosecution agreements. And then last year we ran our first public perception survey of what do Western Canadians think about corruption. All these are available on our website. Happy to talk to anyone about them. Well, let's get into the meat of the matter for today. I'm going to go over beneficial ownership relatively briefly, as I think a number of the people in the room do keep abreast of this issue. So some of the things I bring up here might not be that new to you, but then I'll get into what exactly is our little organization doing to punch above our weight on it. There's no surprise to everyone when the FATF reports came out in 2016, Canada was hammered on the report, especially around beneficial ownership, and the federal government has been trying to play catch up on this issue ever since then to make ourselves look better in time for our review, which I believe is going to be happening next year. We're looking at which countries are in the mix, and I do think Canada is still on the mix for next year. So we've been hounded internationally by the biggest oversight body in the world on financial issues. But Canada has also been hounded by Transparency International as well. In 2014, we signed up to the G20 high-level principles on beneficial ownership and the Australia G20. NTI Canada found in the following year a number of countries weren't doing that well to live up to the standards on beneficial ownership transparency. Not to be that surprising, given it had just been agreed to the year before. But when we came to the 2017 results that were published last year, Canada is still in the very weak framework, back there with only South Korea. Other countries have managed to figure out how to move on, even countries with less advanced systems than us, traditionally the people would think for AML. What is our regulatory framework? A lot of you will even possibly know this far more in depth than me, so be kind when you go to correct anything I'm about to say during the Q&A, but the proceeds, or the PCML-TFA, is our regulatory framework for AML. We have a 25% ownership on significant control of ownership. Generally, other than finances, there's reasonable measures include for taking clients' word for what is beneficial ownership verification, oftentimes a written document or a signed document, or a client's word for it. And there's a number of entities that still don't have beneficial ownership obligations, DNF PBs especially, lawyers especially, within the Supreme Court ruling that a lot of us are aware of, and that the federal government has been working on to talk with the Federation of Law Societies and the various provincial law societies to try and figure out a constitutionally compliant way that they can be in line with AML obligations. Notably, real estate agents aren't on this beneficial ownership disclosure list, and we'll get into the ramifications of that in a moment. What's been going on in the world that the FATF has been ranking Canada, and TI has been ranking Canada, that we haven't been catching up with on norms? Well, for one, the world's first publicly accessible registry was set up in the UK in 2016. And that's a Companies House, the Persons of Significant Controls Registry. It's a landmark tool that was used, pushed through, or advocated for our partner chapter at Transparency International UK. And they've done a great job there of advocating for greater AML controls and greater beneficial ownership disclosure. And then eventually the European Union catching on with Money-Laundering Directive, or Fourth Money-Laundering Directive in 2014 that required the establishment of beneficial ownership registries. And then AMLD5 that required all EU members to establish a public registry by 2020. It was 2022. Anybody spot that right off? I believe it's 2020. And there's still momentum on that. Each country, it wasn't solidified how every country has to put in that registry. We're going to see how they come about. But it's a huge progress. The big gap within there is that trusts aren't covered by AMLD5. Just to go back for 1 second on international standards, within the UK, one of the big comments was, well, that's great for the UK itself, but what about the overseas territories? Well, the House of Lords did pass a bill that the overseas territories would have to have a public registry, and I think a number of you, Eric and I were talking about this before, but a number of you possibly saw the press release last week that the Cayman Islands is now in favor of a public registry. So it was always the comment of, well, that's nice that the UK does it, but there's always the Cayman Islands. Well, now we don't have that excuse, because even the Cayman Islands are coming on board. What's been happening in Canada since we've been scolded by the FATF and by Transparency International? Well, we've had a number of comments within the budgets over the years that there would be movement, and we've had some progress, admittedly, to the government of the day on AML, especially in Budget 2018, that trusts need to provide more information to the CRA. We thought that was good. They did put out a comment that with the Open Government Partnership, that they would look at all options for a registry to adhere to beneficial ownership, including a public registry, which for us, that was a big win, that they're putting that on the books and willing to think about it. For a long time, Finance Minister Morneau was hedging his bets on saying the word public registry. Some of his comments still show that he's a little nervous about it on the privacy issue, and we'll get into a discussion about the whole privacy issue on a registry. And then finally, Budget 2019, we saw new money towards anti-money laundering, a lot of it focused on British Columbia. We would say don't treat anti-money laundering as one regional issue in Canada. It's a Canadian-wide issue, and I'm sure anybody working here in Toronto would agree to that, anyone in Quebec would agree to that. And as soon as you squeeze the pressure on the balloon in one spot, all the air moves to somewhere else. So this is a national problem we need to deal with. Their first step to addressing this issue was, as Eric pointed out, the CBCA that required all private companies to hold beneficial ownership information on hand. And then there were the updates to the PCML-TFA. There was a review of the PCML-TFA that TI Canada did make submissions to, and I want to focus on the beneficial ownership aspect of it. When the review came out by the House Standing Committee, the registry was the first thing that they talked about, which we were happy to see. They do think a registry should be there, but they called for a private registry. And I found that, I'm happy that they brought that into the discussion. I would say that more people than not out of the testimonies were in favor of a public registry, or at least they were saying, let's look at the variables within a public registry. And then they also cited the UK as an example towards the end, which the UK is a publicly accessible registry. So I'd say momentum is still there. We were happy to see a number of their comments about bringing lawyers into line, FinTrack data sharing, which FinTrack is aiming to do a better job of, and greater punishment for improper intermediaries, which there's still discussions about this word, or the wording of reckless facilitation of money laundering, which lawyers in the room might have a better view than I would on how that would actually play out. What else has been happening to move this forward? Well, in the background, to actually move beneficial ownership forward, there's always a comment that we are a federated state, and the federal government can't do this alone. They are only the 4th largest corporate registry in the country, behind Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta. So the provinces have to be on board. There is a working group between the finance ministers on AML issues, and they have been meeting throughout the years. We've heard various things about how much leverage or how much credence they're giving to the issue of beneficial ownership within finance talks at the same time that carbon taxes were being talked about and marijuana legalization were being talked about. But we were very happy to see this past summer that the ministers or those who were present at the meeting did come out of discussions saying we're going to keep pushing this forward. The Finance Minister Bill Morneau talking about looking at a public registry. Finance Minister of British Columbia, Carol James, laying down the gauntlet for her fellow finance ministers across the country to get more done on this issue. So we thought that was very good momentum. And speaking of Finance Minister Carol James, BC has been pushing the way forward because, of course, they're going through the most revelations around beneficial ownership transparency and money laundering within the province, starting with Dr. Peter German's reports that expose the level of corruption, or money laundering, I should say, within casinos, led by Attorney General David Eby, leading up to the passage of the Land Ownership Transparency Act that would put in place the first registry on property in the world. Now, there's still some issues with the legislation in place. It will not be fully publicly available. There is a paywall, and there's still issues around verification. So all these issues with the discussions with the federal government in the provinces are in a two-phase approach. The first phase was the transparency, increasing the transparency around business registries. And the federal government led that with the amendments to the CBCA. British Columbia's pulled through, Manitoba's updating, and the rest of the provinces were waiting for the federal government to up their corporate registry. Phase two is meant to be the discussion about what do we do about a registry. There's been differences, and I don't want to put any words in anyone's mouth, but there has been talk about public consultations on a registry within the new year. We're happy to see that the Quebec government has already started public consultations, leading from now about a week or so ago and going through until mid-December that we'll be making submissions to. So there is momentum at the provincial level. We have two of the larger provinces on board. It's a matter of bringing a number of the other provinces on board as well, especially here in Ontario. If the Ontario government thinks that these money laundering issues are only a problem for British Columbia, or anyone who saw that Maclean's cover 10 years ago that thought Quebec was some kind of special case about corruption, I mean, you don't want to leave the situation until it lands on your lap as a scandal. They can be proactive about this, and this is what we'd hope to see from the Ontario government. So that's the momentum and the issues going forward in the context within Canada. In terms of what we're doing on it, some of you may have seen our reports. Our first one came out in 2016, looking at Vancouver and doing our first research on beneficial ownership. Our second report came out this May, looking at the GTA and beneficial ownership transparency. To quickly go over the main findings, we looked at 100 of the most valuable properties in the Vancouver area and found that almost 50% nobody knew who the true owner was. 25% through Canadian shell companies, 4% through offshore shell companies, 11% through nominees, and 6% through trusts. And a number of these, we profiled a number of mansions, and I mean, this is in the Vancouver Sun, and through reporting all through BC from some great journalists, houses being owned by housewives and university students with no income to their name. And now it's being dubbed the Vancouver model of money laundering. Within the GTA reports, we took a much wider scope. We looked at real estate transactions from 2008 to 2018, 1.4 million transactions. And what we found out of that is that $28.4 billion was acquired during that decade through corporate entities. $25 billion of that residential mortgages were provided through unregulated lenders with no AML reporting obligations. Within the company's purchases, $9.8 billion worth of cash were done through cash, and the percentage of through cash purchases goes up the higher the value of the property. Cash purchases by companies have risen steadily over the past decade, peaking at 45% in 2018. And companies own 37% of homes valued at more than $5 million, and more than half of homes over $7 million. This was a risk assessment, essentially. It wasn't saying that all this money is bad, but it is a high-level warning to the Ontario government about the biggest real estate market in Canada. At the end of the day, our solution, not our silver bullet solution, I would never claim that any tool is a silver bullet solution for addressing any kind of corruption or AML. There's a number of things that have to go forward. But a large piece of the solution, a large piece of the puzzle that a number of other countries are moving forward on is the establishment of a publicly accessible registry of beneficial ownership in Canada. Now I say publicly accessible because in the past I've said a public registry, and some of the Bay Streets, some of yourselves, have heard that as government run. We want it to be accessible by the public. So that means journalists, civil society, and concerned citizens can have access to it. It will be a corporate registry for beneficial ownership. It must have a verification system, garbage data in, garbage data out. We wouldn't want to have something that the data was useless to. We hope that nominees would have to identify who they're working on behalf of. We would like to see trust covered, even though we know that that is a more complex issue. We do want to see that real estate agents have to identify a true beneficial owner on property purchases, and we do want to see enhanced sanctions on money laundering, on acts of money laundering, and more enforcement put into the RCMP on this. We've seen some money come in with the previous budget. We're seeing more talks about more money within the election at the moment, which we're glad to see is coming up on people's radars. Working with us, there's two other organizations. We've joined a coalition. I don't know if you can see the logos. Publish What You Pay Canada and Canadians for Tax Fairness. We're in a coalition that we call ourselves the End Snow Washing Coalition. Who's heard the term snow washing in the room? So basically, snow washing is referred to as just money laundering in Canada. And this came out of the Panama Papers. We were trying to figure out what's a way to explain the complex topic of beneficial ownership to the average Canadian. And it turned out the crooks came up with the term for us. And they described this to their clients as, bring your money to Canada and we'll be cleaned like the pure white snow. Because we have lax beneficial ownership rules, and frankly, who thinks of Canada? Everyone thinks of some tropical island, but not Toronto or Vancouver. So you can find out more about our collected work at endsnowwashing.ca, or on Twitter if you're even talking about this talk, hashtag endsnowwashing. And then why public registry? Why are we so obsessed with the public registry? Why isn't it good enough just for law enforcement to have access? One, it's a deterrent effect. It's a small case study, but there is evidence showing with Scottish limited partnerships, whenever Scotland was included in Companies House data, that SLPs had been rising steadily in incorporation over the past, well, relatively 6 or even a decade years, peaking at around 2016. When Scotland was brought into Companies House, registration dropped off by 80%. So we would point to that as at least one solid case of deterrence. Extra eyes. As much as we would love to say that the RCMP would have a handle on the situation, we just know currently they don't have enough resources, even compared to the money that banks put in on AML, compared to what the government's willing to put in. Extra eyes are required on this issue. If Canada is open for global finance, we think it's fair that Canada would be open for global scrutiny. Now, when the Panama paper data came out, big papers like the New York Times and the Guardian were first looking at this trove of data. It wasn't until that they worked with journalists on the ground in a number of countries where the cash was stolen that they were able to connect the dots as to who stole the data. People on the ground can put together the ideas far better than someone here in Canada as to where the money originated from. Independent monitoring. Some of our partner NGOs in the UK have done a great job of monitoring Companies House, especially Global Witness. They put out the first report criticizing what were the problems with Companies House before the government could. And then finally, it's the global standard moving forward. I mean, the great quote by Wayne Gretzky, move to where the puck is going, not to where it is now. This is where the European Union's going to. This is where more countries are moving to. We've been a laggard on this issue for long enough. It's about time we play catch up with the rest of the world. And then finally, it's good for business. If we just even there's a lot of financial institutions that may think, well, if law enforcement gets access to the registry, surely we'll get access to it. Well, maybe even the lawyers want access to it. And then the real estate agents want access to it. And then how do you regulate that? And more businesses want access to the registry as well. To the point eventually where businesses want to know who they're doing business with. And if we have a free trade agreement with the EU, where all of their countries have publicly accessible registries, it's a decent idea that the EU might expect that Canada have a public registry as well. Why should we have access to their company's information if their companies don't have access to our information? In terms of the fields that we would want in the registry, a unique identifier number, full legal name or other known names, partial date of birth, month and year, a service or correspondence address, not home address, and the nature and extent of interest held within a company. We wouldn't want to publish any financial information beyond that, not people's home addresses either. We're not zealots about this. We do want to balance personal security and privacy with the need to know of the public. And then finally, before we go to Q&A with Eric and I think I went over my 15 minutes. But just in general, if you're wondering how can you get involved, there's a few people here who are part of our working group on beneficial ownership, a couple of companies that we've been talking to in terms of we want to know more information. It's always good for us to talk to more people who are interested in this so we can fill these blind spots of maybe information we haven't thought about. We want a registry that everyone can use, everyone's happy with at the end of the day. We don't want a junk registry. So the more stakeholders we have in this discussion, the better for us, or the better it is for all of us. Our work with Canadians for Tax Fairness and Publish What You Pay Canada, we do have some project funds from the Open Society Foundation, but we do still need to keep the lights on. So if you'd like to become an individual member of TI Canada, you can do so on our website. If you'd like to give a one-off donation, it's very easy to do on our website. Or if you'd like to become a corporate supporter of TI Canada, I'm more than happy to talk about what the benefits are to corporate supporters. So thank you everyone for your time, and thank you. I hope that was interesting information for all of you.
Ready? Now it's time for the tough questions, James. That was the easy part, but now we get to grill you on some of the tougher stuff, and I'll try my best to play the role of Anderson Cooper and keep you honest here. So one of the phrases I really like, and it came up in your presentation, was snow washing. Can you tell the crowd a little bit more about how snow washing relates to beneficial ownership, and why should Canadians care about this issue?
Yeah, so as I said, the term snow washing, we didn't even come up with it. The crooks came up with it, and you can find the main series about the term coming up in the Joint Toronto Star CBC. It was like a 5-part series that came out about 2 years ago that really did well. And as I said, it's a way for a lot of people to just grab on to something. I do a lot of press interviews, and even on call-in shows, you hear the complexity of the subject, but that term snow washing gives it something a little bit tangible. But then inevitably the next question is, well, why should Canadians care? I mean, it's a lot of money that not everyone necessarily sees. A lot of it doesn't necessarily come from Canada. So who cares, really? I mean, yeah, it sounds bad, money laundering, but how does it affect me? Well, one, property prices. Now, I never say that money laundering is the reason property prices have gone up, but the BC government did commission a report on the effects of money laundering and property prices, and found on average it went up at around 7% across province of BC. Now that's BC as a total, that's not even the lower mainland. So to argue that money laundering doesn't have an effect on property prices, I would say in the reverse way, that's naive. Now where the other area where it comes up is money is not always coming from outside of Canada. Money laundering is facilitated within Canada. I mean, it's drug dealers and crooks and tax dodgers in Canada who are using the loopholes here. And the RCMP found that a majority of money laundering cases do use beneficial ownership to purchase property anonymously. And then even the crime, funnily, like the Vancouver model, there's been a lot of the focus has been on money from China and real estate and casinos. But it's also mixed in with the fentanyl trade in Canada. I mean, the money has to be washed in some way. So it's domestic crime, it's domestic tax dodging, it's international crime finding a parking place. Whenever I look at announcements about international aid in Canada, you have to factor in what are we doing about global money laundering. Because it's great that we are committing to foreign aid and we are helping overseas, but we got to make sure that that money isn't just finding its way into an empty condo on Lakeshore in Toronto.
The statistic that I find staggering is from the C.D. Howe Institute. Their latest report on $100 billion is their estimate on the amount of money being laundered in Canada each year. I'll read a quote from the report. Offenses such as drug trafficking, fraud, tax evasion, smuggling, and corruption are fueling the laundering of this dirty money. And they highlight that the secret sauce in this recipe, so to speak, is the creation of legal arrangements that hide the beneficial owner of that corporation your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there was a couple numbers that came out this year. So the BC real estate panel, they put the number at about 43 billion, and then there was the CD Howe Institute that put it at 100 billion. And to some degree, I mean, the money is significant and is relevant, but it's also the impact. And that's always what I try and get across in corruption. And that's what I'm saying about the connection with holes in our foreign aid system, the connection with drug peddling, the connection with zoning and empty property that people, our generation is trying to get in on the housing market while there's empty safety deposit boxes in the sky for crooks overseas. It's that impact at the end of the day that hits people. And so the money, while staggering, you've got to look at what does it do to the average Canadian, what does it do to the people overseas who are losing the funds to kleptocrats who want to find a safe hiding place here in Canada.
So you've talked about this Vancouver model quite a bit, but I know your organization put out a report earlier this year on the GTA, and you touched on this in your report, but again, one of the numbers that came out of there since 2008, so for the past decade or so, over $28 billion being laundered in GTA real estate. What were some of the key observations from the report, some of the takeaways?
Right, so a lot of people have asked, were you surprised about the numbers? And no, I wasn't surprised. This basically trends with whenever we say Canada is a global city. Other global cities face this issue. Miami, New York, London, Doha are facing similar issues like this. So it was, again, naive to think that we can somehow, just by the grace of the good Canadian, avoid this issue. What I would say about it is, again, that it was a risk assessment. And it's not to say that a corporation owning property is illegal or should be illegal. It's about the risk that's there in the loopholes to buy this property. And that's what we want to close. And that was the warning sign we were trying to send to the government, both federally and provincially, that this is not just a Vancouver issue, even though they're making the highlights on this.
Right. So those are some of the issues affecting ordinary Canadians themselves. We'd like to discuss some of the policy recommendations that you touched on in your presentation. In June, as we've discussed, the government made amendments to the CBCA. What are your views on those changes? Do they go far enough?
Yeah, no, absolutely not. The amendment to the CBCA is essentially, as we see it, is a stepping stone to get businesses to get their house in order on beneficial ownership information that hopefully will eventually lead to a registry. Because with the CBCA amendment, they have to give over the beneficial ownership information to law enforcement within a reasonable time. And law enforcement has to make the request for that beneficial ownership information in person or by mail. So talk about giving the criminals quite the lead-in to letting them know to scurry off and start a new business. So we do hope that this is just the beginning and it doesn't pause there and the discussion goes forward. Just on impact to Canadians, I just want to go back for 1 second on beneficial ownership. It's often tied to money laundering, but the province that really kicked off beneficial ownership transparency was Quebec and the Charbonneau Commission. And there it was the faulty invoicing that went on through construction firms. And beneficial ownership and anonymous companies facilitated that whole issue. So this is why we see Quebec taking a lead. This is now why we see British Columbia following suit, because they face the scandal as well. And I have to talk, and I don't want to say which cities because it was in confidence, but there are cities that are saying, yeah, it's not just the money laundering, it's contracting as well at the municipal level, the issue of beneficial ownership. So again, coming right down to where people live, the idea that companies can rip off taxpayers through contracting, or even some nefarious people be involved in contracting as well.
So I'll go back to one of your points there, and I think it's valid that we need law enforcement to have access to a registry. So what are your thoughts on and we've had debates at length on this issue, on a registry that would be accessible for law enforcement, tax authorities, but not the general public?
I mean, all those actors, as I said, all those actors need the access, but that doesn't go far enough, simply because there's just, I'd love for law enforcement, AML, to have enough resources to do this. But let's be realistic, especially with our track record on anti-money laundering enforcement in this country. We still have to fill in the amount of vacant seats in AML departments in Canada. And it's just a matter of also knowing where to connect the dots on the information. Our partners at Transparency International in African countries, Latin American countries, Eastern Europe or Asia, or even Europe, I'd hate to say it's only developing countries where the money gets stolen. They can help connect the dots on this. Journalists working, happy to have the press here at this talk, and glad to see that beneficial ownership is making national news, and money laundering is making national news this year, that the Prime Minister even had to comment on it. But these are all eyes and ears that we need on the issue to help connect the dots, find information.
Okay, so we've seen in certain jurisdictions, certainly the UK leading the way on this. Lessons learned from the UK Companies House and their current registry.
Yeah, so I'm sure a number of you have seen the critiques that came out about Companies House, but the biggest problem is verification that they have. There was no drop-down menus for location or country of residency, so you get a lot of United Kingdom, UK, U.K, U.K, Cornish, and you have people being born that are negative 100 years old. So that was a fault in the system. And as we've talked with our partners at Transparency International UK, don't hold us up as the gold standard. Hold us up as the guinea pig. Learn from our mistakes. Don't say, well, TI or Companies House looks like this, therefore the thing doesn't work, or therefore that's the only way to do it. We've got to learn from the mistakes that they've made. And I mean, there has only really been one case, so they're having enforcement problems too. And that was somebody who wanted to prove how bad they are at currently conducting enforcement on the issue.
Right.
So Companies House does have a ways to go, and they are putting out their own reports about it. But it's out there. It's better that somebody managed to test run it, and that we need to learn from it.
So I was reviewing some of the findings, and there's actually 76 people on that list who also happen to be on the OFAC list in the US. So no doubt there's some good initial starts out of the UK there. I'm curious, I mean, we talked about some other jurisdictions like the Ukraine, the Cayman Islands, who are able to, who are starting to implement registries. Your thoughts on why Canada has lagged behind a little bit on this one?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple issues about the politics of the day on the issue, and the fact that money laundering is now a national issue that three of the main parties have all talked about in their platform. The Prime Minister himself addressed this year. For a while, it wasn't really at the top of the list, and you only had international organizations that specialized in the issue kind of pressing down on foreign affairs and a bit on finance as well. And then it always came back to, well, the provinces were a federated country. And I've even had our partner organizations in the US, surprisingly, and in Europe always say, well, why can't the federal government just go ahead and make their own registry? And I have to explain the nature of federal provincial politics to all of them. So there has been that excuse in the past, but as you said, if even Ukraine, in the middle of having an existential threat on their borders and even inside their country, can implement this registry, and if Cayman Islands, the default answer for everyone about, well, how good can this really be as a global trend, if they're going for a public registry, and then if the EU as a whole block is going to bring this in, and then finally, if they're doing it, what's our excuse? And people will finally exhaustingly say, well, what about the Americans? They don't even have a private registry. Well, there is legislation going through Congress to make a registry. Now, that will be a private registry, but hopefully there will be pressure to eventually make it public. And I would still point out the problems with it only being a private registry.
Right. So I want to address sort of the political response so far and what's going on. We're obviously in the middle of a federal election campaign. And I was drawn to a recent article in the Globe, written by our friend Rita Tritcher over here, entitled "Canada Needs Action, Not More Studies to Deal with Money Laundering," where she makes, I think, the very valid point that report after report from domestic sources have outlined in painstaking detail the weaknesses in this country's AML regime and in a lot more sectors beyond just real estate. The last thing Canada needs, she quotes, is another costly exercise that enables more parliamentary procrastination. How do we move this issue beyond parliamentary procrastination and towards some real implementation?
Right. I'm not going to endorse any of the parties. We're a nonpartisan organization, and through our grant money on this project, I actually am not allowed to endorse any party. But I'll just kind of comment a bit on them. I'm really glad that all parties are at least addressing AML on the platform, depending on where it is, and we'll hold them to account after the election. Whoever forms the government, whichever parties form the government, we'll see next week. But it went from inquiries to moving ahead. And the thing about inquiries is, BC is going through the Cohen Commission right now. And I think that's a good move on their part because they put the legislation first. And I agreed with the Attorney General on that path. When it looked like they were really hesitant to do an inquiry, I was a little nervous about that. I was hoping that they would hear the will of the people, and they did. But he said we need to take action first, and I applaud that decision. There are steps going forward. There already is dialogue between the federal government, the provinces, and the territories. So there's no real need to slow that down with an inquiry right now. We're conducting studies. It's great to have Public Safety Canada conduct studies, but the idea, and it's okay to have the inquiries, but the methods to address the problem are already there. An inquiry would be useful in doing deeper structural dives. And I hope with the Cohen Commission in BC, the public wants accountability on individuals, and that's fair. At the end of the day, the public, we do things from a structural point of view. We try not to do investigations and name names. That's not what our organization does. There's a lot of great investigative journalists who do that, and law enforcement. We will do it when push comes to shove. But without addressing these structural issues, you're just forever kind of chasing your tail. And a national inquiry post getting key legislation into place and key systems into place, I think that's okay. But let's not stall the recommendations that we've put out there, the Financial Action Task Force has put out there, and a number of industry players have already testified in the PCML-TFA review.
Makes sense. So along the lines of implementation, I know you're working on an implementation study right now. Can you tell us, you covered some of this in your presentation, but what type of fields would be required? Let's look at some of the nuts and bolts.
Yeah.
What fields are you looking at? What type of information would businesses be required to fill in to constitute this registry?
It's interesting. When we first started kind of publicly advocating for this, we had some testimonies in Parliament, and the second you say, we want to have a public registry, we get hammered by a few MPs saying, well, I don't want to put my bank account. Well, tell me your bank account. It's like, nobody wants your bank account information. We want tombstone level, business card level information of legal name and other aliases, partial date of birth, not full date of birth, service address, which I know a lot of mom and pops or independent contractors would have their home address as their service address, so that is like a kink we would have to work out, whether it's non-disclosed, but there's remedies around that. And then extent of ownership. Now, right now the standard is 25%. We have tossed out the idea of 10% to be in line with securities, and there are even other bodies that talk about 10%. The FBI in testimony has even argued that the US should go to a 10%. We've heard arguments the other way. I think that one's up for discussion, but there's still the 25%. rule. There's whether you would have politically exposed persons or not. There are complications around that based on the definition of it in different jurisdictions. I think that's still open for discussion. But what we wouldn't put in is citizenship or tax residency, because we are looking at the privacy angle of this and what would be constitutionally compliant and PIPEDA compliant, and we do know that those would not. So, in terms of us pushing for a publicly accessible registry, we have our limits. We're not unreasonable. I've even heard one journalist say, let's have SIN numbers up on it. Like, absolutely not. So those would be the main things. And then you come into, well, how do you verify it? And that's part of the implementation. And there are smarter digital minds than myself, definitely, but there's the old paper method about having a copy of a government document that's signed being submitted, and the ways around that you wouldn't be doing it through the mail. And then there's digital ID methods, such as having third-party verification systems. That's a very interesting method to have, is whether the government can catch up with that technology. So there are the methods out there, and a lot of them are worth discussing as to what the best one going forward is. But I think the summary of that is that there are solutions to a lot of these problems.
So you touched on the privacy equation there briefly. What do you say to people who object to this concept of making this information transparent on the basis that people do have the right to their information, both personal and corporately, staying private, staying with their lawyers, sealed away? How do you handle that objection of privacy, which has become certainly one of the biggest issues internationally in recent years?
Yeah. So, one, I would say we don't want all of everyone's information. So we're limiting the amount of fields that we would want. And as I said before, Minister Morneau keeps touching on the privacy angle. We want a registry so long as it doesn't invade people's privacy. What I would say to the idea of you don't have a right to know any of my information, it's my business, my corporation. The idea of establishing a corporation in Canada was never to hide people's identity. It was to limit liability and facilitate ease of business. And we had an event in May where we had the Privacy and Access to Information Commissioner of Ontario make that point, saying you actually don't have a right to hide behind a corporation. That wasn't the point of it, and there is no constitutional or legal right. We do have a paper coming out next month where we are doing we have done a constitutional review of the fields that we want to make available, and checking also with Canada's privacy acts. And from a legal perspective, based on the fields that we would want available, our requests hold water from a privacy point of view. And people may push back, well, that's fine. Maybe constitutionally, you don't have a right, but I still want it. I'd still push back. You don't have a right, and given the balance of public good to the information, the very limited information we want to make public, I would say we're striking a good balance on keeping people's privacy with giving the public access of need to know.
Good point. And so in this room today, James, we have AML officers, risk and compliance professionals, who may feel a little bit skeptical about the likelihood of a public registry coming into existence. What's been the feedback you've been getting so far from the financial community, and why should financial institutions care about this?
Right, so we're TI Canada and TI in general, we pride ourselves on being multi-stakeholder platforms. We want to work across the board with other civil society. We always want to work with the government, and we want to work with business to find solutions. And within our coalition that we're working with other organizations, we're consistently talking to the federal government about where they are on this. I mean, law enforcement as an institution hasn't come out in favor of a public registry, but I keep talking to a number of law enforcement that would be open to that. Now, none of them speak on behalf of law enforcement, but we're getting good reception to this. We have at least one province on board with this, so this comes to where does private sector stand. Well, we are always searching for the private sector to sign on board with us. We do have a public letter that we sent out to Minister Morneau in December that has a number of individuals from Bay Street and beyond who have signed on, and a couple of companies who have signed on, and even industry associations. So we do have the Investments Industry Association of Canada, who has publicly come on board for a public registry. They even made that testimony in their PCML-TFA testimony. The Federation of Law Societies of Canada have come out in favor of a public registry. And we're still talking to a number of other industries. Now, this issue of privacy has been a stickler for a few industries that have been on the fence. I won't name who's who because they haven't come out yet. But we're hoping that our privacy report that comes out next month will help kind of win them over and get them over the line to say, okay, we're comfortable with talking about this. And even within some financial institutions, again, I won't say which ones, you do have individuals who are very on board with this, but the institution as a whole still waiting or saying talk to our industry association, and the industry association saying talk to our members. So we're in a little bit of a loop with them, but we are hoping to talk to more of their AML people to come on board. A number of people are on board with a registry. And then there becomes this idea that once the registry comes out, even if it's private, well, we'll all get access to it. Maybe it won't be public. Well, you've got to do the back end for that to give it accessibility. And then if one is, as I said before, if one industry gets access, another industry will want to get access, especially as we expand the amount of bodies that do need to do beneficial ownership reporting. The more you spread that out, the more people want to get in. In fact, if you get to the point of jewelers, then the Jewelers Association will want to be on board. And then you had the Ontario Real Estate Association in an interview. They publicly came out in favor of a public registry. So we're talking to CREA as well to see where they stand on the issue. But we're always willing to talk to industry. We always want to have meetings with industry to hear, well, what's the issue that's keeping you from going over the line? Let's work together, figure out, some myth busting around these issues, because we've been doing myth busting for a while. Because sometimes people have said, it just doesn't feel right. Well, okay, well, what doesn't feel right? Let's walk you through it to the point where we can find agreement on this.
And I think to your point, the Canadian MSB Association
they came
was
out.
also
Thank you for
in favor of that, as they see the regulations here imposing even more stringent compliance on them, and they recognize a need for an open registry for all.
Right, yeah, and I turn it to you for 1 second, Eric. The thing that's been surprising through this is the third-party due diligence companies who have been coming on board to be in our corner and really advocate with us and support us on this issue. And you've been with us in Caseware, thank you for it. So it's always been interesting. We've kind of thought, don't we disrupt your business model if this is a public registry? So it'd be interesting for you to give comment on, why are third-party due diligence firms so in favor of the public?
Yeah, in terms of third-party due diligence firms, anybody that's curating watch lists for financial institutions to use for screening and for transactions monitoring, I use the analogy of a sanctions list, the OFAC list, where this is publicly accessible information, but that almost morphs on a daily basis now, especially in the case of sanctions, that data changes over the time and needs to be enriched and maintained. So in terms of due diligence providers, there's great benefit to having this accessible to all. I think there's a real added value for financial institutions there. And they see their role in the overall equation, again, not as those who source the original data, but that can enrich it, keep it up to date, and get it into the hands of FIs. Not to mention, in a world with so much data, many financial institutions struggling with normalizing that. How do you turn big data into actionable intelligence? And so I think there's a real role to play even for some of those firms that you mentioned in assisting financial institutions in this role, but certainly
Yeah.
there's been a lot of support, to your point,
And it's-
on making this public.
Yeah, and I'd say that point of actionable intelligence, that goes right back to why make it public and why give civil society or investigators from other countries around the world who will be able to connect the dots better than we could in Canada access to it. It makes it actionable.
Nice. So steps taken so far, you touched on in your presentation the BC Land Registry, LODA, the Cohen Commission, amendments to the CBCA. Are you satisfied with? So a couple questions. Are you satisfied? Does that give you optimism that there are being steps? And if you had a crystal ball here and you could put some kind of timeline on a public registry, what would that time frame look like?
Right. Well, I mean, the election, we'll see what happens. All parties, I mean, even if the Conservatives wind up making the government, there's precedents there to appeal to them on this issue. It was Stephen Harper who signed up to the G20 high-level principles. So it's a bipartisan issue. All parties are in favor of moving forward. So the election results don't concern us. We've been working with one government. So of course, you have to get up to speed the next government, but the same bureaucrats that we've been talking to and who have been working with their partners at the provinces are in place. It's not like the money laundering issue as a national issue just goes away after the election. So it's a matter of keep hammering ahead and holding whichever government to account, and also talking to the provinces, because as we keep getting repeatedly told, this can't be done by the provincial or by the federal government alone. So we have Quebec coming on, well, moving forward on this. We have BC moving forward. And our message to the Ontario government and the Alberta government and anyone else is that don't wait for this to be a scandal like Quebec and BC unfortunately had to wait for. Make sure that you get ahead of the curve and be open. I mean, from the Ontario point of view, Ontario is open for business. Let's make sure it's clean business, essentially. And then our timeline, we would like to see in place by about 2022 the legislation that passes to say a public registry will go into place.
Do you think it'll take more scandals to get there, to achieve that time frame?
I think
what type of strategies is your organization employing to make sure this issue is top of mind in Ottawa?
Yeah, it's always a two-pronged issue of talking to stakeholders and making sure they're aware of the situation, that this doesn't require scandals, that the means are there, that the urgency is already there, and bringing them on board, and bringing industry and the government together and civil society together to talk about it, but also is putting out the reports when we need be. So the GTA report, that did manage to get quite a lot of interest, and it came out the same week as the federal budget, so there was a lot of pressure around there. We got only a very small response from the Ontario government, unfortunately, and I certainly hope that they pick up a greater response in the future, because we're not going to quiet down about this. So it's either we educate, we have a very cordial discussion about this and we work in partnership, or we have to keep clamoring at the cage, and then we have the cordial conversation relationship. But with industry as well, we want them to be there with us to show the interest from industry for this. So we do want to keep talking to industry to help us get there.